Welcome to Morphology 101, brought to you by Learning Network Educational Services, which is part of the Alberta Professional Development Regional Consortia. This presentation has been prepared by myself, Charlie Craig, and my partner in crime, Lana Lane. You can reach out and connect with us at any time. If you have questions related to the content of this particular video, you can also connect with your local consortia office found throughout the province of Alberta. When you're looking at morphology, you inherently have to also consider etymology, which is the history of the word, and phonology, which is that pronunciation, grapheme, phoneme correspondence piece. So although this is Morphology 101, what we're really looking at is orthography as a giant umbrella as we look at human thought made visible as text. So what is morphology? Morphology is simply the study of words and their parts. One of the ways that you can think about or start the thinking around morphology is to back yourself all the way up to what makes a word a word. And this conversation can happen from our littlest of learners to our biggest of learners as they attempt to articulate and explain how they know when they're reading a word on the page that that is in fact a word. You may wish to, with younger students, use some samples or examples where they would need to sort them into, yes, this is a word or this is not a word. But it's important to keep in mind a couple of things. Some of the most basic definitions that you would consider as you look at a page is the spaces on either side of that to show you that those letters are going together, that there's a combination of letters involved, probably some consonants and vowels, that there's an agreed upon meaning or definition. And the interesting thing about this conversation with older students is understanding that our what makes a word, it grows over time. And so we collectively have to agree on the meaning associated with this particular collection of letters for it to become a word. When you see something like the heart emoji or emojis in general, they really have become their own language of communication. And if you happen to have any older teens in your life, you'll know that some of those pictures don't mean what you think they mean. And so you need to have all parts of the criteria, the letters, the spaces, the agreed upon meaning, in order for a word to be a word. So if you're wondering what a great place to start would be in your classrooms, this conversation would be a really interesting place to start. Because when we look at something like this one here, lowercase I is not a word. But we know if that was an uppercase, that would be a word. And so it's not always a collection of letters. In that case, that example, it is a letter. It just happens to be the uppercase of that letter. Sue Hegland's book, Beneath the Surface of Words, is an amazing resource if you happen to be interested in learning more around morphology and the way we build and understand words. And in her book, she talks about how morphology is not an advanced topic. It's in fact the foundation of the entire spelling system. And knowing that it's the foundation of the entire spelling system, it makes sense to start having conversations with even our littlest learners around different aspects related to morphology. She also says we spell English words by systematically combining one or more structural units. We call those structural units morphemes. But I really want to focus here on the word systematically. This has not been done in a willy-nilly sort of way or nonsensical, which is oftentimes how we dismiss different kinds of spellings in English writing. And you might have words for them in your classroom, like ghost words or tricky words. Or when someone asks you how to spell something, you just, oh, this English language is just so crazy. In fact, what it is following a system and patterns within that system and conventions in how we bring together morphemes. The piece that we don't have when we're dismissing it that way is an understanding of why it's spelt the way it is. And for me personally, that was never something that I recall exploring in younger grades. I could never explain to you why a certain word was spelt the way it was, but I could probably recall the spelling of the word. And so this why piece becomes, I think, a big part of morphology and understanding what's going on beyond memorize this rule. Oh, and here's 5 exceptions to the rule, because that makes it no longer a rule. So when we look at morphemes, we can sort morphemes into 2 categories. We can sort them into bases and affixes. Every word contains a base. A free base is when the base alone can spell a word. A bound base can't exist by itself. There has to be some sort of an affix attached to it in order for it to function as a word, in order for it to convey that meaning that we talked about. Twin bases is another layer of complexity that we are not going to spend time on, but basically it's when 2 base elements come from one Latin verb. So it's really a category within a free base or a bound base, but it is something that comes up as you go deeper and deeper into your understanding of morphology. Affixes are the stuff we attach to our bases, and we can also split those into some different categories. Prefixes and suffixes are probably some that you're very familiar with, but we also include those connecting vowel letters in that affix category, because there are times when we throw another letter in there in order to make the suffix usually work with the base. The interesting thing about our new curriculum is that from K to 6, there is an expectation that we are doing work around morphology, which could be the reason, in fact, that you're here listening to this particular recording. Well, in kindergarten, it doesn't reference morphemes or morphology in the outcome. It does say that we're going to explore and play with new words. And this idea of playing and exploring and being curious about words can carry us through all the way past and beyond grade 6. In the curriculum, you will notice that under the knowledge section primarily is where you're going to find the expectations around certain prefixes and suffixes that you're expected to explore with your students. Unfortunately, I think due to our lack of personal experience, we default into a worksheet around adding certain prefixes or suffixes to a base. Or let's look at this prefix and here's all the words that use this particular prefix. This is not to say that worksheets are bad and that we shouldn't have pencil paper practice in our classrooms. However, if it's the only way that we're exploring language, it very quickly removes the curiosity and wonder that can come when we're using this idea of exploring and play. So I would encourage you to try to adapt several different classroom routines or activities that allow you to be curious about language and then extend that curiosity into an inquiry, into a question, into an exploration where you're building understanding over time. The first concept that I think is really important, or one of the concepts that's important when understanding morphology, is that we talk about word families. When we're talking about word families in relation to morphology, what we're actually talking about are words that share a common base element and a common root. This is not rhyming words. And so historically in education, we've often talked about word families related to rhyming word collections like the at family, rat, bat, mat, sat. That is not what we're talking about here. And in order to avoid confusion, we encourage you to no longer refer to those rhyming collections as word families. You can talk about them as a rhyming collection of words, a rhyming word gang, whatever you want to use. But when we're talking about word families, what we're really talking about are words that are sharing a common base element and have some sort of common root or meaning. If we were talking about a family reunion, the people who are gathered, or the words that are gathered at the family reunion, all share a common root. But what gets you a space on each different word's picnic basket is that you also share a common base. So allow me to explain that for you. If we look at the word please, P-L-E-A-S-E, as a base, and we look at this collection of 12 words in the chart, we could start by asking ourselves, which of these words that are gathered here are connected to the word family please, which means they're going to share a base of please in some way, and they're also going to share this root, which happens to be Latin in nature. So if I look at the word happy, H-A-P-P-Y, there's no connection in the letters between happy and please. So obviously happy is not part of this word family. If I was doing this activity with a group of students, I would probably have these words written on cards in a bag. This is often called the word bag activity. And as you pull out the words one at a time, you ask students to tell you and explain if they think this particular word that's on the card is part of this family. So please would be, in one circle, and then we'd have a spot for the non-family members. And so happy would go over in the non-family members section. Now I look at the word plea. And P-L-E-A is found in both P-L-E-A-S-E, please, and plea. But when I think about plea in a meaning sense, I think of like pleading and begging, which I don't necessarily think of when I think of the word please. So I'm not sure if that would be part of the family, but then I can say to myself, is SE a known affix? Do we know that that is an actual suffix that we add? Well, I know ES is a suffix that we add, but I don't think SE is one. And as you're talking to students, if they do think it is that SE is an affix that we use, then you can ask them to think of another word that uses that particular affix. And in this case, they're probably not going to find one. So I would put plea over in the not in the family section. Now, maybe the next word I pull out of the bag is pleased. Here I can see the word, the base word please in that word. And I know that to spell the word pleased, I take the base P-L-E-A-S-E and I add the suffix ed. And so while I explain that, so obviously it shares a base, it shares a meaning because it's the past tense of this particular word. So it's going to go into my word family of please. I would do that with each one of the words here. Interestingly enough, there are words in this list that are connected by root that share the placere, and I don't speak Latin, so if I've said that wrong, feel free to let me know, that particular Latin root actually applies to a number of the words in this example. This might be something that you'd want to do with older students as they really become aware of roots and how we build different word families. So if we were going to the Placeri family reunion, so all of these words here share this historical Latin root, then these words would be allowed to come to the family reunion. We're going to go back here. Happy and lovely are not invited to the family reunion, and neither is ease. Okay, while it shares some of the letters, PL is not a prefix, so that doesn't work. Plea and please, as in more than one plea, will sit on a blanket together because they are part of that word family. On the please blanket, in that family where please is the base word, we would include pleasurable, pleasing, displeased, and pleased. Placate and placid both would be invited to the Placeri family reunion because they have this common root. However, they would sit on a different blanket. Now, we could ask students who else, what other words could join placate and placid on their respective blankets, and that could be in another conversation. While we're here looking at this, I did want to highlight a little fun fact for you. You'll notice here that we have an E on the end of please, and this E right here is acting as a marker. It is the final non-syllabic E. We have all sorts of names for it. And sometimes it's called the helper E, the bossy E. But what it's actually doing here is canceling out the plural. So what here, when I'm reading and I see this ends in an S, my brain knows that by this ending in an S, it's more than one of the preceding letters, PLEA. In order for my brain to not have to think about a whole bunch of things while I'm reading, this E is put here to cancel out the confusion that it might cause in relation to the plural factor. So it's a plural canceling E. That's the role of this marker right here. And so while I'm reading, I will read it quickly. And I know because that E is there, I'm not talking about more than one plea. I'm actually talking about another thing. Others examples of this, and you can ask your students to go on a hunt where they think the E is doing this plural canceling action, include nurse or house. And it comes back to this idea that's the primary function of spelling is meaning making. And so in order to really be clear about the meaning, that E is there to cancel out any confusion related to please. So what could this look like in your classroom? There's a number of different ways that you can do this exploration. And obviously you're going to craft these experiences to the students' level in your classes, as well to your comfort level and the intentions of your particular lessons. But let's just say you've gotten to a place where you're ready for your students to just explore words. You might share with them a poem or a picture book or a paragraph out of a read aloud that you're doing with your students, older students, a novel, and ask them to select a word. So we're going to start here with this A Pizza the Size of the Sun poem. And I would read this poem aloud to my students. There might be a time where we take this apart and we look for some rhyming words and we talk about the structure of the poem itself. Maybe I'm going to use this to illustrate, stanzas, rhyme scheme, repetition. But then I might want to use it to talk about vocabulary. So after reading the poem to my students, I would provide them these instructions. Pick a word from the poem. Ask yourself, how is it built? In other words, what's the base? And what are the affixes, if there are any, attached to the base? Once you've done that, you ask the students to think of all the words that they can that would join in that word family of that particular word that they've selected. So the words, of course, are connected by meaning and share a base. So they're the ones that would sit together at the family reunion on the picnic blanket. So if I looked at this poem and I picked the word sun as my base here, I could brainstorm a whole bunch of words that I think of when I think of the word sun. One of the strategies that you'll hear different folks use in relation to illustrating the different parts of words, the different morphemes, is to box the base. So you draw a box around what the base of the word is, and then you underline the affixes involved. Now, inevitably, someone is going to pick the word pizza, and they might only get 1 or 2 words in their list, and that's okay. If that's what they do, then you say, hey, pick another word. How about the word, and maybe you have some suggestions for them. I want you to do one now with the word eat. I'll even give you a hint. Eat is the base. And what are all the words you can think of that would be part of the EAT, eat family? Once you've done this activity, you can ask your students to make some observations. What do they notice about the affixes? What do they notice about the base? The base is the same in all of them. Yep, that's a really good indicator that it's part of the word family. Your students might notice that now in this particular case, I've got a number of compound words, and burn itself, flower, light, roof, and day, are in fact their own bases. And so when we're talking about a compound word, we're actually talking about a word where 2 bases are combined to form a new word. So that should, those other halves of the compound word with the word sun should have a box around them. Maybe I would do that in a different color. I'm also noticing here that when I underline Y as the affix, in the first example, I have an extra N there. And once students make that observation, you might ask them if they can think of other examples of words where we double that final consonant before adding that particular suffix to the word. Interestingly enough, I also have a situation here where my Y was changed to an I, and I've added ER as my suffix. Can I think of other examples where the Y is changed to an I? And then we can proceed with that same level of curiosity. Why do we think that's happening? We can build a hypothesis, and we can do some investigating around other samples and examples of where we see this happening and why we think it might be happening. The great part about being curious about language is that you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be part of the seed planting and the approaching of things with that genuine curiosity to motivate them to continue digging it up. Now, the next step in this, and we're moving beyond what I would call the 101, but we're looking at building word sums. And it's basically just illustrating how we put the parts together to make the new words. And this in itself can be a full session of learning, plus lots of extra practice. But I did want to just illustrate to you how you might show or create word sums to help explain how different words are made. The other way that you can look at this is through a matrix. And it's important to remember that when you're building a matrix, it is rarely complete, and it's evolving as your understanding of the particular word grows. So what you might think is a free base to start, you later on learn it's actually a bound base. You just didn't know that that part could be taken off to be its own chunk of the word, its own morpheme. And that's okay. It's all part of that digging deeper and understanding around word and word parts. The last bit, and this happens to be my favorite part, is when you go exploring for the story of the word. So, and that should say word, not world at the top, my mistake. The story or the history of the word is this pet project that this gentleman has done, where he has created an online etymological dictionary for like tons of words. And so you could type in a word and basically it explains to you how that word has evolved over time, what the root word likely is, and other words that then share that particular root. And to me, it's just fascinating to see how language evolves and grows over time, and how words that we think are maybe current or new actually, have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. We have a series called Morphology Mondays, and we just started it recently. We're going to run it monthly. It's at the third-ish Monday of every month, and the registration remains open and ongoing on our Learning Network website. Please join us if this is an area of interest for you. If there's any questions that you have related to this video, please reach out and ask. We are here to help and make this job as easy as it possibly can be. And sometimes the easiness then comes from knowing that someone's there to help you build your foundational knowledge related to a concept that you've been asked to teach. Hope you have a great day. We'll chat soon.